Bold introduction. Imagine a country so vast that it stretches across 11 time zones, where the sun rises in the icy Pacific and sets thousands of miles away on the edge of Europe, a land so immense that it could swallow entire nations: Canada, the United States, even all of Western Europe within its borders, and still have room to spare. This is Russia, a nation whose sheer size has shaped not only its destiny but the fate of continents. But what's truly astonishing isn't just the scale of Russia's territory, it's the story of how it came to be. Because just 1,000 years ago, the idea of a unified Russian state was little more than a fantasy. The land was a wild, untamed expanse, home to scattered tribes, mysterious forests, and endless steppes. There was no Moscow, no St. Petersburg, no empire, just a patchwork of warring principalities and nomadic peoples, each fighting for survival in a world where power shifted as quickly as the seasons. So, how did this chaotic frontier transform into the world's largest country? Was it the result of brilliant strategy, ruthless ambition, or simply the luck of geography? And what secrets lie buried beneath the surface of Russia's relentless expansion? Stories of betrayal, conquest, and survival that most history books barely mention. Today, we're diving deep into the untold saga of Russia's rise, peeling back the layers of myth and legend to reveal the real forces that forged a superpower. From the frozen rivers of the north to the windswept plains of the south, every inch of Russian soil has a story to tell. But to understand how Russia became the giant it is today, we have to start at the very beginning, long before the world had ever heard the name Russia. And as you'll soon see, the truth behind this transformation is far more complex and far more dramatic than you might ever imagine. The land before Russia, long before the world recognized anything resembling Russia. The land itself was a vast, unpredictable wilderness. Imagine endless plains stretching as far as the eye could see, broken only by dense, ancient forests and winding rivers that seemed to flow forever. This was a place where survival depended on strength, cunning, and the ability to adapt to a landscape that could be both breathtakingly beautiful and brutally unforgiving. The region that would one day become the heart of Russia was a crossroads of civilizations, a meeting point for countless tribes and cultures, who left their mark on the soil but rarely stayed for long. Centuries before the rise of Moscow or the glimmer of imperial ambition, these lands were home to a shifting mosaic of Indo-European and Germanic tribes. The Scythians, fierce horsemen known for their skill in battle, roamed the steppes, while the mysterious Sarmatians and later the Huns swept through, leaving chaos in their wake. Even the legendary Goths, who would one day help bring down the mighty Roman Empire, passed through these territories, drawn by the promise of new lands and the challenge of the unknown. Each group left behind traces, burial mounds, weapons, and legends that would echo through the ages. But despite the constant movement and upheaval, there was something about this land that drew people in. The rivers, especially the mighty Volga, acted as natural highways, connecting distant regions and making trade possible even in the harshest conditions. Over time, small settlements began to appear along these waterways, places where different cultures mingled, traded, and sometimes clashed. Yet, for all their activity, these early communities were fragile, always at the mercy of stronger neighbors or the unpredictable forces of nature. What's often overlooked is just how fragmented and vulnerable this region was. There was no single power, no unifying force, just a patchwork of principalities and tribes, each with its own customs, languages, and ambitions. The idea of a Russian nation was still centuries away, and the land itself seemed almost to resist the very notion of unity. But beneath the surface, the seeds of something greater were quietly taking root. The stage was set for a dramatic transformation, one that would begin not from within, but from the arrival of outsiders who saw opportunity where others saw only chaos. And as the next chapter unfolds, the arrival of these newcomers would change the fate of the region forever. The Viking invasion and the birth of Rus. The transformation of these wild, scattered lands began with the arrival of outsiders who saw opportunity in the chaos. In the 9th century, a new force swept in from the North. Norse adventurers, better known as Vikings. While most people picture Vikings raiding the coasts of Britain or storming the cities of Western Europe, their ambitions stretched much further east. These were the Varangians, fearless sailors and traders who navigated the treacherous waters of the Baltic Sea and ventured deep into the heart of what would one day become Russia. Guided by the great rivers, the Volga, the Dnieper, and the Dona, Vikings carved out new routes for trade and conquest. They didn't just pillage, they settled, establishing fortified outposts that would grow into some of the region's most important cities. Names like Novgorod and Kiev began to appear on the map, each one a testament to the blending of Norse daring and Slavic resilience. The Vikings, known locally as the Rus, didn't remain outsiders for long. Over generations, they intermarried with the local Slavic population, adopting their language and customs while introducing their own systems of governance and warfare. This fusion of cultures gave rise to the first organized states in the region. The Kievan Rus, centered around the city of Kiev, emerged as a powerful federation of principalities, united by trade, shared interests, and the ever-present threat of outside enemies. For the first time, the scattered tribes and settlements of the vast Russian landscape found themselves part of something larger network that stretched from the icy north to the warm shores of the Black Sea. Kievan Rus became a hub of commerce, connecting the riches of Byzantium and the Islamic world with the resources of the north. But this new order was fragile. The principalities were often at odds, and the unity forged by the Rus was constantly tested by internal rivalries and external threats. Still, the legacy of the Vikings was undeniable. They had laid the foundations for a new civilization, one that would endure long after their own power faded. The story of Russia was no longer just a tale of wandering tribes and fleeting empires. It was becoming the story of a people who, through a mix of ambition, adaptation, and sheer determination, would begin to shape their own destiny. Yet, as the region grew in strength and complexity, a new and even greater threat was looming on the horizon, one that would test the very survival of everything the Rus had built: Mongol domination and the rise of Moscow. As the fledgling Russian states were finding their footing, a storm was brewing far to the east, one that would sweep across the steppes with a force no one could have predicted. In the early 13th century, the Mongols, led by the legendary Genghis Khan and his ruthless successors, unleashed a wave of conquest that would forever alter the course of Russian history. These nomadic horsemen, masters of speed and strategy, moved with terrifying efficiency, crushing any resistance in their path. For the scattered principalities of the Kievan Rus, the Mongol invasion was nothing short of catastrophic. Cities that had flourished under the Rus, Kiev, Ryazan, Vladimir, were reduced to ashes. Entire populations were wiped out or forced into submission, and the survivors found themselves living under the shadow of a new and merciless overlord. The Mongols established the Golden Horde, a powerful khanate that demanded heavy tribute from the Russian lands. For nearly 2 centuries, the Mongol yoke pressed down on the region, shaping its politics, economy, and even its culture. The once proud principalities were now vassals, their rulers forced to travel to the Khan's court to beg for the right to govern their own people. But even in the darkest times, seeds of change were quietly taking root. While many cities struggled to recover, one small principality began to rise above the rest. At first, it was just another minor outpost, overshadowed by its more illustrious neighbors. Yet, through a combination of shrewd diplomacy, strategic marriages, and a willingness to cooperate with their Mongol overlords, the princes of Moscow slowly gained power and influence. They became the favored tax collectors for the Golden Horde, amassing wealth and prestige while their rivals faltered over time. Moscow's leaders began to challenge the Mongols' authority, uniting neighboring territories under their banner and building a sense of shared identity among the Russian people. The turning point came in the late 15th century, when Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, refused to pay tribute to the Mongols, signaling the end of foreign domination. The rise of Moscow marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the Russian lands would no longer be defined by foreign rule, but by their own ambitions and the relentless drive to expand. Yet, as Moscow's power grew, so did its appetite for more territory, a hunger that would soon propel Russia into a new phase of explosive growth. The Tsars and relentless expansion. With the Mongol yoke finally broken, Moscow emerged as the beating heart of a new Russian state, and its rulers wasted no time in pursuing their ambitions. The age of the Tsars had begun, and with it came a relentless drive to expand, fueled by a mix of fear, opportunity, and the desire to secure Russia's place among the great powers of Europe and Asia. The man who would set the tone for this era was Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. Crowned as the first Tsar of all Russia in 1547, Ivan was both a visionary and a tyrant, remembered for his sweeping reforms as well as his brutal purges. But above all, he was determined to push Russia's borders ever outward. Under Ivan's rule, The Russian state launched a series of bold campaigns against its neighbors, the once mighty Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, remnants of the Mongol Empire, fell to Russian armies, opening up the Volga River and the Caspian Sea to Moscow's influence. These victories were more than just territorial gains. They were symbols of Russia's growing power and its ability to overcome centuries of foreign domination. But Ivan's ambitions didn't stop at the southern steppes. He set his sights on the vast, mysterious lands that lay beyond the Ural Mountains, Siberia. The conquest of Siberia was unlike anything Russia had attempted before. It was a land of endless forests, frozen rivers, and fierce indigenous peoples who had never bowed to any outside ruler. Yet, driven by the promise of furs, gold, and new opportunities, bands of Cossacks, legendary warriors, and explorers ventured eastward, carving out new routes and establishing outposts in the wilderness. Their journeys were perilous, marked by harsh winters, hostile encounters, and the constant threat of starvation. But their determination paid off. Within a century, Russian explorers had reached the shores of the Pacific Ocean, claiming a territory so vast it defied comprehension. This eastward surge was more than just a land grab. It was a statement to the world. Russia was no longer a collection of vulnerable principalities. It was a rising empire, stretching from the heart of Europe to the edge of Asia. The Tsars' appetite for expansion seemed insatiable, and each new conquest only fueled the desire for more. Yet, as Russia's borders grew, so did the challenges of governing such a sprawling domain. The seeds of future conflicts and rivalries were being sown, even as the empire celebrated its triumphs. And as the world would soon discover, Russia's ambitions were not limited to the east. The next chapter would see the Tsars turning their gaze toward the west, determined to secure their place among Europe's most powerful nations. The Western ambition, Peter the Great and Catherine's empires. Russia's empire stretched ever eastward. The Tsars realized that true power meant more than just endless land. To be taken seriously by Europe's great powers, Russia needed access to the West, its trade, its technology, and, most importantly, its warm water ports. This ambition would define the reigns of two of Russia's most transformative rulers, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Their vision was nothing less than to drag Russia, often kicking and screaming, into the modern age and onto the world's stage. Peter the Great was a force of nature, towering over his contemporaries, both literally and figuratively. Obsessed with Western innovations, he traveled incognito through Europe, learning everything he could about shipbuilding, science, and statecraft. When he returned, he unleashed a whirlwind of reforms, determined to modernize Russia's military, government, and society. But Peter's ambitions weren't just about changing Russia from within. He wanted to secure a foothold on the Baltic Sea, a gateway to Europe that had long been denied to Russian rulers. This dream led to the brutal Great Northern War against Sweden, a conflict that would last over 2 decades and cost countless lives. But Peter's persistence paid off. With victory came new territories and the founding of St. Petersburg, a city built on swamps and ambition, which he declared Russia's new cupola window to the west. Catherine the Great, who ruled a few decades later, shared Peter's hunger for expansion but set her sights on the south. Under her leadership, Russia waged war against the Ottoman Empire, seizing key cities along the Black Sea and pushing the empire's borders ever closer to the heart of Europe. Catherine's reign also saw the dramatic partitions of Poland, as Russia, Prussia, and Austria carved up the once mighty Commonwealth. These acquisitions brought millions of new subjects under Russian rule and cemented the empire's status as a continental giant. But these triumphs came at a cost. The rapid expansion created a patchwork of cultures, languages, and loyalties, making the empire increasingly difficult to govern. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, as newly conquered peoples resisted Russian control, and old elites bristled at the Tsar's reforms. Still, the achievements of Peter and Catherine were undeniable. They had transformed Russia from a landlocked, inward-looking kingdom into a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire with one foot in Europe and the other in Asia. Yet, as Russia's influence grew, so did the anxieties of its neighbors. The stage was set for new rivalries and conflicts, as the empire's ambitions collided with those of other great powers, and the consequences would echo across the continent for generations to come. Western ambition. Peter the Great and Catherine's Russia's empire stretched ever eastward. The Tsars realized that true power meant more than just endless land. To be taken seriously by Europe's great powers, Russia needed access to the West, its trade, its technology, and, most importantly, its warm water ports. This ambition would define the reigns of two of Russia's most transformative rulers, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Their vision was nothing less than to drag Russia, often kicking and screaming, into the modern age and onto the world's stage. Peter the Great was a force of nature, towering over his contemporaries both literally and figuratively. Obsessed with Western innovations, he traveled incognito through Europe, learning everything he could about shipbuilding, science, and statecraft. When he returned, he unleashed a whirlwind of reforms, determined to modernize Russia's military, government, and society. But Peter's ambitions weren't just about changing Russia from within. He wanted to secure a foothold on the Baltic Sea, a gateway to Europe that had long been denied to Russian rulers. This dream led to the brutal Great Northern War against Sweden, a conflict that would last over 2 decades and cost countless lives. But Peter's persistence paid off. With victory came new territories and the founding of St. Petersburg, a city built on swamps and ambition, which he declared Russia's new cupola window to the west. Catherine the Great, who ruled a few decades later, shared Peter's hunger for expansion but set her sights on the south. Under her leadership, Russia waged war against the Ottoman Empire, seizing key cities along the Black Sea and pushing the empire's borders ever closer to the heart of Europe. Catherine's reign also saw the dramatic partitions of Poland. As Russia, Prussia, and Austria carved up the once mighty Commonwealth, these acquisitions brought millions of new subjects under Russian rule and cemented the empire's status as a continental giant. But these triumphs came at a cost. The rapid expansion created a patchwork of cultures, languages, and loyalties, making the empire increasingly difficult to govern. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, as newly conquered peoples resisted Russian control, and old elites bristled at the Tsars' reforms. Still, the achievements of Peter and Catherine were undeniable. They had transformed Russia from a landlocked, inward-looking kingdom into a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire with one foot in Europe and the other in Asia. Yet, as Russia's influence grew, so did the anxieties of its neighbors. The stage was set for new rivalries and conflicts. As the empire's ambitions collided with those of other great powers, and the consequences would echo across the continent for generations to come. Revolution, Soviet Union, and modern borders. As the 20th century dawned, the Russian Empire's immense size became both its greatest strength and its most dangerous weakness. The cracks in the imperial facade were widening. Economic hardship, political repression, and the growing discontent of countless nationalities simmered beneath the surface. When World War I erupted, Russia was thrust into a conflict it was ill-prepared to fight. The war's staggering losses and the suffering on the home front ignited a firestorm of revolution. In 1917, the centuries-old rule of the Tsars collapsed almost overnight, swept away by a wave of anger and hope for a new beginning. But the end of the monarchy was only the beginning of Russia's next transformation. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a dramatic coup, promising peace, land, and bread to a war-weary population. What followed was a brutal civil war between the Reds and the Whites, a conflict that tore the country apart and left millions dead or displaced. When the dust finally settled in 1923, a new superstate had emerged, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR. The Communists managed to hold on to most of the old empire's territory, but some regions like Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states broke free, establishing their own independent nations. The Soviet Union quickly became a force to be reckoned with, but its borders and influence would shift again in the chaos of World War II. As Nazi Germany invaded in 1941, the USSR faced its greatest existential threat. The cost was staggering. Tens of millions perished, but the Soviets ultimately pushed the invaders back, sweeping across Eastern Europe in the process. In the aftermath, the USSR absorbed the Baltic states and established a ring of communist satellite regimes from East Germany to Romania, extending its reach deeper into Europe than ever before. Yet, the Soviet era was marked by contradictions. Propaganda painted the USSR as a workers' paradise, but behind the scenes, economic stagnation, political purges, and ethnic tensions simmered. By the 1980s, the Soviet system was crumbling under its own weight. Mikhail Gorbachev's attempts at reform came too late to save the Union. In a stunning series of events between 1990 and 1991, the USSR dissolved, and 15 new countries emerged from its ruins, including Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the modern Russian Federation today. Russia remains the world's largest country, but its borders are the product of centuries of upheaval, ambition, and conflict. The legacy of revolution and empire still shapes its politics and its place in the world. And as new disputes and old rivalries flare up along its vast frontiers, the story of Russia's borders is far from over, leaving the world to wonder what the next chapter will bring. Conclusion: the legacy and future of Russia's size. Standing at the edge of a map, tracing the vast outline of Russia, it's impossible not to be struck by the sheer audacity of its existence. No other country has ever spanned such a colossal stretch of the globe, from the icy Arctic tundra to the sun-baked shores of the Black Sea, from the forests of Eastern Europe to the windswept Pacific coast. But Russia's size is more than just a geographical fact. It's a living legacy, shaped by centuries of ambition, conflict, and survival. Every border tells a story. Every region holds echoes of battles fought, alliances forged, and cultures blended or erased. Yet, the consequences of this relentless expansion are still unfolding. Governing such a sprawling, diverse land has always been a monumental challenge. The Russian state has had to contend with everything from logistical nightmares — how do you connect a village in Siberia to the capital thousands of miles away — to the deep-rooted tensions between its many ethnic groups and regions. Even today, the scars of past conquests and forced migrations linger, fueling debates about identity, autonomy, and the true meaning of being Russian. Modern Russia's borders are the product of both triumph and tragedy. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 redrew the map overnight, leaving millions of ethnic Russians outside the new federation, and sparking disputes that still simmer in places like Ukraine, the Caucasus, and the Baltic region. Reports claim that some in Moscow still dream of restoring lost influence, while others warn that the burdens of history could threaten the country's stability from within. Meanwhile, ongoing controversies over territories like Crimea and the Kuril Islands keep Russia's frontiers in the global spotlight, raising questions about the future of its vast domain. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Russia's story is its resilience. Time and again, the nation has faced invasions, revolutions, and near collapse only to re-emerge, changed but unbroken. The sheer scale of the country has been both a shield and a source of vulnerability, shaping its people's sense of destiny and their view of the world. As new challenges arise — technological change, shifting alliances, and the unpredictable forces of global politics — Russia's size remains both its greatest asset and its most daunting test. So, as we look at the map and marvel at the enormity of Russia, we're left with a question: is this vastness a blessing, a curse, or something in between? The answer, like Russia itself, is complex and ever-changing. One thing is certain: the story of how Russia became the world's largest country is far from over. And as history has shown, the next chapter could be just as dramatic, unpredictable, and world-shaping as those that came before.